Zoe's world crumbled when her lover, Blaine, mysteriously vanished in Mexico City. Days turned into agonizing weeks, filled with worry and sleepless nights. Finally, a message arrives. Zoe, my house, 30 minutes. It's from Blaine. He's alive. Overwhelmed with relief, Zoe rushes to his apartment, finding him weak but alive. Tears stream down her face as she holds him close, desperate to make sure he's real. But Blaine remains guarded, haunted by the horrors he endured. As they begin to heal, a strange intimacy develops. Zoe finds herself shaving Blaine's face, their bodies close, the tension palpable. But beneath the surface, unspoken fears and unspoken secrets simmer. What happened to Blaine in Mexico City? Will Zoe and Blaine be able to overcome the trauma of his disappearance? Can they rebuild their trust and move forward? Or will the past forever haunt their relationship?
Zoe sprayed shaving cream into her hand, raising Blaine's razor towards his face. He'd asked her to help him shave off the whiskers he'd grown during his time in Mexico City, but never having shaved a man before, Zoe was nervous. "Am I doing this right?" she asked him tentatively. "Yes," Blaine praised. "Now just don't accidentally slit my throat with that razor, and you'll get a gold star." Immediately forgetting her nervousness in the wake of his sarcasm, Zoe took the glob of shaving cream in her hand and smacked it into the center of Blaine's face, bursting into laughter at his look of surprise. The brilliant smile on Zoe's face blinded Blaine's eyes. How could he be annoyed if just a little prank could make her smile so happily? Of course, not being annoyed and not getting payback were two different things. Blaine reached out his hand and scraped some of the foam off his face before smacking it onto Zoe's nose in retaliation. She sputtered, but Zoe refused to admit defeat, promptly spraying a thick layer of foam onto his chin. She sat on the sink and laughed. "Now I know what you'll look like in your old age." As Zoe said this, Blaine snatched the shaving cream from Zoe's hands and sprayed it on her forehead so she looked like she had white hair. "And now I know what you'll look like as a little old lady." Zoe reached for the shaving cream can to retaliate, but Blaine raised it high over her head so she couldn't reach it. No you don't," Blaine smiled as she struggled to reach it. "Well, if you don't let me have it, I can't shave you," Zoe retorted, folding her arms defiantly. "Promise you're done first," Blaine ordered, raising his eyebrows. Zoe wished she'd thought to spray those arrogant eyebrows as well. "Okay, fine, I won't play with you anymore. Come closer, come over here so I can reach you." She smiled and waved the razor in her hand. Blaine obediently moved his chin towards Zoe. "Now stay still. If I cut you, I won't be held responsible." Zoe used her left hand to hold his cheek, while her right hand held the razor as she slowly moved it under his chin. Her every movement was cautious, as if she feared that she would injure him. As Zoe worked, neither said anything for long moments, falling into a companionable silence. Once Zoe grew more comfortable with her task, she casually asked him, "I heard you had to walk nearly 2 hours a day back and forth in Mexico City to call me?" Zoe was trying to be nonchalant, but she was carefully observing Blaine's facial expressions. She was very curious about his answer. "I heard that while I was gone, you were unable to do anything well," Blaine quickly responded. "Who said that? That's nonsense!" Zoe flatly rejected the idea. "I have voicemail proof. Should I play it back for you? It's a little garbled, but I think you'll recognize the voice." The corner of Blaine's mouth curved into a smirk. "Don't!" Zoe curled her lips and grabbed Blaine's hand, which was reaching for his phone. Unexpectedly, she softened her tone, raised his hand, and gently rubbed her cheek against his palm. She said softly, "During that time, I was really afraid that you wouldn't come back." Zoe's eyes turned watery as she thought about how helpless and worried she had been while he was missing. She couldn't help but confess the words she had been holding in her heart. "I made a huge mistake at work that day. My boss was nice about it, just said to be more careful, but I felt terrible. However, I know why it happened. I couldn't think straight while you were missing. My mind was full of thoughts about where you were, how you were doing, and whether you were cold or hungry. At that moment, I was really afraid that I wouldn't ever see you again. As Zoe said this, she looked up at him tearfully. "Blaine, promise me in the future, don't do something so dangerous again, okay?" Blaine raised his eyebrows and looked at Zoe's teary face. There was a raging fire in his chest, burning with excitement. However, Blaine didn't allow himself to show it. He leaned closer to Zoe, looked her straight in the eye, and asked in a low voice, "What kind of status do you have to ask such a thing of me?" Although his tone was calm, the fervent anticipation in his eyes betrayed the deepest, truest thoughts in his heart. Zoe didn't know how to respond. She bit her lips, unconsciously trying to escape his question. She lowered her eyes and asked softly, "You don't want to agree?" With a single sentence, Blaine's resolute heart melted. This woman was destined to be his weakness. Blaine sighed silently and said, "I agree." No matter what they were to each other, he couldn't deny her. Zoe smiled through her tears. Just as she raised her head, a shadow fell over her. Suddenly, the front door buzzer sounded. Zoe was surprised. She snapped out of her daze and reached her hand up to stop Blaine. "Someone's here." He looked at her slightly flustered face and raised his eyebrow. "What are you scared of?" Zoe bit her lips nervously. Blaine tilted his head and looked at Zoe closely before reaching over to check the door monitor on the wall. His brow furrowed when he saw Sophia, who in a stroke of epic bad timing, was currently standing outside. Zoe saw the concern on Blaine's face, so she followed his line of sight and saw Sophia standing there. Zoe's face paled, and she quickly jumped down from the sink counter. Blaine shifted his gaze back to Zoe. He looked down at her with stormy eyes, as if he was waiting for Zoe's decision. Seeing Zoe biting her lips and not saying anything, Blaine decided for her. "I'll open the door." "No!" Zoe stretched out her hand to stop him. Blaine turned his head to look at her again. His eyes darkened. His lips were slightly cold as he knowingly asked, "Why?" Zoe took a deep breath, feigning indifference. "Didn't we agree not to let her know?" Blaine's eyes flickered with traces of shock and hostility. "Zoe, what if I say that I want to break off my engagement to her for you?" Zoe didn't expect him to say such a thing so suddenly. She was stunned, and her mind went blank for a few seconds before she snapped out of her daze and shook her head. "Blaine, don't be impulsive." "Impulsive?" Blaine smiled at Zoe as if he had heard the funniest joke he'd ever heard from her. "Zoe, do you think that what I feel for you is an impulse?" Zoe's entire head felt slightly dizzy. She didn't expect the whole thing to end like this. Zoe shook her head awkwardly as she steeled her heart and forced herself to say, "Blaine, I never wanted you to break off your engagement to her for me. And I never meant to be with you, just to make a deal with you. You've misunderstood." "Say what you just said again," Blaine yelled, his body exploding with hostility. Zoe could clearly see the fury in his eyes. He reached out his hands and restrained Zoe, pulling her into his arms. He glared at Zoe with hatred. "Zoe, repeat what you just said to me." Zoe's heart ached to look at the cold, sullen look on his face. With tears rolling down her face, she repeated herself. "I never wanted to be with you. I only approached you for money. I don't want Sophia to know about my relationship with you. I never meant to be with you, just to make a deal with you. Do you understand?" Zoe's words were like sharp blades, piercing straight into Blaine's heart. All of a sudden, he felt like a huge fool. For the sake of this woman, he would do anything. He thought her intentions were the same as his own, but what about the result? In the end, he was just a long-term meal ticket for her. Blaine gripped Zoe's wrist tightly. His fingers dug into Zoe's skin, causing her to frown in pain. Suddenly, without any warning, Zoe was brought along by Blaine and pushed against the cold tile wall of the bathroom. She felt a gust of cold air rush by her face before a heavy, muffled sound sounded in her ear. Blaine had punched the wall beside Zoe's face, releasing all the anger and hatred in his heart. "You're bleeding!" Zoe was so anxious that she reached out to grab his injured hand, but he abruptly stopped her. Blaine pressed Zoe heavily against the cold tile wall. A pair of cold eyes stared fixedly at Zoe, as if they wanted to tear her apart and devour her. Blaine roared at Zoe. Zoe was truly shocked. She had seen Blaine angry before, but she had never seen him this angry. He was completely enraged. His voice was as cold as ice, and the hostility surrounding his body was shocking. Zoe trembled as she bit her lips. She stared at him tearfully, looking into his furious eyes. She could see the fury in his eyes, but Zoe could also see the pain in them. Seeing his anger and pain, her heart hurt so much that it felt like it was being torn apart. He pressed Zoe against the wall, and she heard his cold, pain-filled words. "Zoe, you're despicable." She collapsed against Blaine's shoulder and burst into tears. She wished that she could tell him how much she loved him, how much she wanted to be with him. But with so many obstacles in her way, what could the path ahead bring them other than more pain and terror? When Zoe thought of how Catherine Dexter had threatened their son time and time again, she didn't dare to defy his mother. Because with every step she took, she was betting on Max's life. No mother would gamble their child's life in such a way. The sound of Zoe crying was like a sharp saw slicing into Blaine's heart. He leaned over Zoe, both of his arms braced on the wall beside her head. Blaine panted heavily, and the beads of sweat dripped from his forehead. He could feel that his back was drenched in blood. His movements just now aggravated his injury, causing his wound to open. But Blaine didn't feel any pain in his back. The pain in his heart, so great, it drowned out everything else. The only sounds in the bathroom were the sounds of Zoe's crying and Blaine's heavy breathing. Blaine cared deeply about this woman, but he still made her cry. Blaine's heartache made it hard for him to breathe. He hoarsely whispered to Zoe, "What am I going to do with you?" This was the second time the woman in his arms had broken his heart. The second time, he was so powerless that he didn't know what to do with her. "Leave." Blaine's voice was harsh and heavy. His throat felt as if a knife had cut it. He turned around and let go of Zoe without a shred of nostalgia. He leaned his body against the icy cold wall, closed his eyes, and breathed heavily, allowing the sweat to flow from his forehead. His handsome face was now devoid of color. When Blaine let go of her, Zoe grabbed her clothes off the floor and quickly dressed. When she stood up and turned around, Zoe saw Blaine's injured back, which was dyed red with blood. Zoe screamed in fear as tears immediately rolled down her face. "Blaine, you're back! You're back!" Zoe cried out, sobbing. "There's so much blood! How can there be so much blood? You need help!" He closed his eyes and didn't look at Zoe. A cold smile plastered on his lips. Looking at Blaine's pale face, Zoe was utterly flustered. I'll call 911. Hold on, don't move." She had never seen so much blood. The deep red that covered his entire back was horrifying. Zoe had never seen Blaine look this weak before. He was breathing heavily with great difficulty, and his face was so pale that it seemed devoid of life. Zoe was terrified. Zoe quickly ran to his bedroom to look for her cell phone. Her hands trembled as she rummaged through her bag. When she finally found her phone, she was about to dial the number when a big hand grabbed it and slammed it against the wall. With a bang, the phone shattered into a million pieces on the ground. Blaine let out a hoarse bellow. "I said leave!" "What are you doing?" Zoe shouted, now also furious. Tears flowed unrestrained from her eyes. "If you're angry at me, then so be it, but don't risk yourself to spite me. You're bleeding." Blaine glared fiercely at Zoe. He was sweating profusely. His back hurt, but he didn't care. His brow furrowed as he took labored breaths. "Zoe, you don't have the right to meddle in my business. Put away that heart of yours, which is so overflowing that it's disgusting." His face was filled with unconcealable disgust and deep loathing. Blaine felt like a fool. Zoe's big heart made him think she was in love with him again and again. She wasn't in love with him. Zoe just cared about people. Blaine wasn't special. She'd ruthlessly proven this to him again and again through her repeated rejections. He felt like an idiot. Blaine stormed over to the bedside table, picked up his wallet, pulled out a wad of bills, and threw them into Zoe's face. "Here, payment for serving me. Take the money and leave. Immediately get out of my sight." The money danced in front of Zoe's eyes, causing her heart to hurt even more, and her tears continued unrestrained. She bit her lips and clenched her fists. She stood there, watching as the money rained down in front of her, feeling helpless. At that moment, Zoe wished she could tell him everything that had really happened 4 years ago. However, the moment she opened her mouth, she felt her vision darken. Then Zoe suddenly lost consciousness and fainted. Zoe! Zoe! When Zoe woke up, it was late at night. She was surprised to find herself lying in her own bed.
Zoe awoke in her own bed, the memory of Blaine's furious face and the icy tile wall still vivid. Had she lost him forever? His words echoed in her mind, cruel and unforgiving. But then, she remembered the sight of him, his back a horrifying crimson, his face pale and drawn. Was he all right? Had he gotten help? As she sat up, a chilling emptiness settled over the room. Was this truly the end of their impossible love? Can their love survive this devastating blow? Will Blaine be able to recover, both physically and emotionally? Hi, Zoe here. If you are wondering what happens next, then download the Pocket FM app and listen to the exciting episodes of Rekindled Heartache now.